Hey guys, tonight we're not heading into a bloody battlefield, or watching some king lose his mind in a velvet-lined palace. Nope. Tonight is about something a little quieter, slower, softer. We're talking about light. More specifically, the flickering, greasy, and occasionally smelly light of candles in colonial America. So, grab your blanket, settle in, and maybe dim your lamp, because it's about to get waxy. Now, before electricity, before gas lamps, before TikTok keeping you awake at 2 a.m., people basically lived in the dark. And candles were their best option for pretending they weren't slowly being swallowed by eternal night. But here's the thing, candles back then weren't just romantic little mood setters. They were survival. And they were also, frankly, kind of gross. Let's float back to the 1600s and 1700s. Colonial America. Picture a settlement, wooden houses, muddy roads, a church at the center, and, once the sun went down, pure darkness. Like the kind of dark where you suddenly understand why half the fairy tales include wolves, witches, and people getting lost. Because one step outside after dusk, and good luck. Unless, of course, you had a candle. And this is where the candlemaker comes in. These people weren't just crafting cute decorative things for Bath and Body Works. No, they were making the single most important household item, right after food and, arguably, rum. And just like rum, candles had their quirks. Now, here's the thing about early colonial candles. They weren't exactly Yankee candle material. The most common kind was made from tallow. And if you're wondering, what's tallow? Well, imagine rendering down cow or sheep fat until it becomes a congealed, waxy substance. Then you dip your wick in it again and again until you get a candle. Sounds appetizing, right? Colonial homes reeked of this stuff. Nothing says good night like drifting off to sleep with the faint aroma of beef stew wafting out of your bedside candle. And of course, because life in the 1700s was all about fun, these tallow candles also smoked. A lot. So, imagine sitting by the fire, your one candle sputtering next to you, filling the room with both light and the delightful haze of cow smoke. Truly magical. But hey, not everyone was suffering. If you had money, or at least knew a beekeeper, you could get your hands on beeswax candles. And beeswax was the good stuff. It burned cleaner, smelled nice, and lasted longer. Basically, the colonial version of a luxury brand. Owning beeswax candles was like saying, yes, I'm middle class, and I'd like you to notice. Churches especially loved beeswax candles. Nothing says holiness like a room filled with that sweet honey-scented glow while the peasants outside were choking on tallow fumes. And then there were bayberry candles, rare, but deeply admired. Colonists discovered that if you boiled bayberries forever, you could skim off a thin layer of wax. It took something ridiculous, like a bushel of berries just to make a handful of candles, but the payoff? They smelled amazing. Fresh, herbal, and nothing like beef. But because of the effort, bayberry candles were reserved for special occasions, like Christmas, or when you really wanted to flex on your neighbors. Now, you might be wondering, who actually made these candles? And here's where it gets interesting. Candle making wasn't always a specialized trade in the colonies. A lot of it happened right in the home. Women, because of course it was women, would set up giant vats of hot tallow or wax, then spend hours dipping wicks over and over again. The process was repetitive, messy, and basically the 18th century version of standing in line at the DMV. Except instead of renewing your license, you were making sure your family didn't spend winter in complete darkness. And just to make this image even cozier, picture a group of kids helping their mother dip candles in tallow, the smell of animal fat filling the house, little fingers probably getting singed because OSHA wasn't invented yet, and the dog licking up stray drips from the floor. Good times. But sometimes there were professional candle makers. Towns often had a chandlery. Yep, that's the fancy name for a candle shop. These guys made bulk orders for taverns, churches, and wealthier households. And because this was colonial America, they often made soap too, because apparently if you knew how to boil fat, you might as well do both. Efficiency. Candles were so central to life that they even had etiquette rules. For example, you didn't just waste a candle by burning it in the daytime. That was seen as reckless and, frankly, suspicious behavior. If you burned too many candles, people might think you were showing off, or worse, dabbling in something unholy. Because why would you need extra light unless you were hiding sins? And, just for fun, candle theft was actually a problem. They were valuable. So, yes, in some towns, you could be punished for stealing candles. Imagine being thrown in the stocks not for bread, not for coins, but for walking off with a bundle of smelly tallow tapers. As with most things in colonial life, candles also tied into superstition. People believed that a candle blowing out suddenly could mean a death in the family. Lighting candles on certain holidays was thought to bring luck or ward off evil. And, of course, there were ghost stories. Colonial households loved the drama of a candle mysteriously guttering out in an empty room. Spoiler, it was usually just bad tallow. So, the next time you light a scented candle to relax, just remember, somewhere in colonial America, a family was dipping wicks into sheep fat for the 100th time, praying that this batch wouldn't smell like old stew. And honestly, they'd probably be very jealous of your vanilla latte candle right now. So, let's float into a colonial evening. Imagine the sun setting, no street lamps, no buzzing neon lights, just the sky slowly turning black. Once the last ember of daylight was gone, the entire town slipped into a sort of half-silence. Unless you had candles. Those little sticks of tallow or wax didn't just give light, they gave you a couple more hours to be human before surrendering to sleep. And here's the thing, people treated candlelight almost like money. It was rationed, counted, and treated with suspicion if you had too much of it. In most families, only 1 or 2 candles would be lit at night. That was it. Forget about turning on every light in the house like we do now. Back then, the thought of burning 6 candles at once would make your neighbors whisper that you'd lost your mind, or worse, that you had secret gold hidden somewhere. Dinner was by candlelight, but not the romantic kind. A single stubby taper in the middle of the table, its flame guttering every time someone moved. You could barely see your food, which might explain why colonial cookbooks were big on stews and porridges, easy to eat in the dark, no matter what it looked like. Now, taverns were another story. A good colonial tavern was loud, smoky, and the beating heart of the town. And lighting one was a whole operation. Dozens of candles, some wedged into iron chandeliers, some stuck in wall sconces, all dripping wax while men drank their ale and debated taxes, or complained about the weather, which was basically the same thing. Imagine trying to look dignified while your wig threatened to ignite under a low-hanging candle. Colonial nightlife. Dangerous, yet cozy. Churches, though, had the best lighting setup. They were the one place you might actually see multiple beeswax candles burning at once. Sermons stretched on for hours, so the clergy leaned hard on that golden, steady glow. The symbolism was obvious. Light of God, warmth of faith. Also, please stay awake during this 3-hour homily on sin. And honestly, the scent of beeswax probably helped keep parishioners from gagging on their neighbor's tallow stench. Bedtime rituals were also ruled by candles. Families used them to mark the hours, sometimes even measuring time by how far a candle had burned down. There were candle clocks with nails stuck in the wax. When the nail dropped, clattering into a metal dish, it meant another chunk of time had passed. No need for fancy clocks when you had wax and gravity doing the work. Of course, if your tallow candle was extra smoky, your whole room might double as a fumigation chamber. But hey, at least you knew it was midnight. And speaking of midnight, colonial nights weren't like ours. People didn't sleep in one solid block. They practiced segmented sleep. First sleep, then a waking period in the middle of the night, sometimes an hour or 2 long, then second sleep. And what did they do during that mysterious midnight gap? Read by candlelight, pray, whisper with family, maybe slip outside to check the animals, or, let's be honest, raid the pantry for a snack. All by that same flickering flame. So, yes, insomnia wasn't a modern invention. It just came with more cow smoke back then. Of course, candles also dictated safety. Fire was a constant fear. Leaving a candle unattended could mean losing your house, your barn, or your entire settlement. There were endless warnings about trimming wicks properly, snuffing flames before bed, and not letting children play near open light. Which is funny, because kids were also expected to help make the candles. But once the thing was lit, absolutely not. Don't even breathe too close. And here's where the irony kicks in. The same object that kept people safe from stumbling in the dark was also the thing most likely to burn everything to the ground. Colonial newspapers were full of tragic little notices. Mrs. So-and-so's barn consumed by accidental candle flame, apprentice lost after knocking over taper. It was such a normal hazard that people barely blinked. Candles even made their way into social life. By candlelight was an actual phrase for entertainment. Families read aloud, played music, or just sat around gossiping, their shadows dancing on the walls. Courtship sometimes happened in this dim, flickering setting too, which meant a lot of people probably fell in love without actually seeing the other person very well. Nothing like realizing in daylight that your mysterious candlelit beauty was, in fact, just Tom from the next farm over, missing half his teeth. And, of course, there were laws about candles. Some towns restricted when and how many you could burn during shortages. Wars, famines, or bad harvests meant fewer animals for tallow, fewer bees for wax, which meant nights got darker, and people had to adjust. Imagine the frustration of being told you could only burn one candle after dusk, as if life wasn't depressing enough in 1703. One more fun thing, traveling at night. Most colonists avoided it, but if you had to move around after dark, you carried a lantern. These were usually metal boxes with holes punched in them and a candle stuck inside. The holes made little glowing patterns on the ground as you walked. Very cute, until the candle went out in the wind and you were left stranded in complete darkness, trying not to fall in a ditch. Colonial life was just a series of small humiliations. And that, really, is the story of candles in everyday use. Not glamorous, rarely efficient, but absolutely necessary. Without them, life shrank to daylight hours. With them, you got a few more hours to scrape by, laugh with friends, or scare yourself with superstitions when the flame guttered unexpectedly. A fragile, flickering extension of the day. So tonight, if you're listening in bed with your soft electric lamp glowing, just imagine trading that for a smoking hunk of beef fat wax. Cozy, right? Now that we've wandered through the everyday world of candles, the smoky dinners, the tavern chandeliers, and the desperate candle clocks, it's time to drift into the softer, stranger side of things. Because in colonial America, candles weren't just practical. They were also mysterious, symbolic, and occasionally a little spooky. People back then loved to read meaning into ordinary objects. A candle wasn't just a lump of wax, it could predict the future, guard against evil, or ruin your luck if you used it wrong. And of course, everyone believed this because when your world is mostly darkness, the tiniest flicker of light feels like magic. Let's start with superstitions. One of the big ones, if a candle flame flickered or guttered for no reason, it meant a ghost was in the room. Because obviously it wasn't the cheap tallow sputtering, it was Uncle Jeremiah dropping by from the afterlife. A candle suddenly going out? That was even worse. It could signal a death in the family. Imagine trying to relax before bed, your only light goes out, and suddenly the whole room is whispering, well, guess somebody's not waking up tomorrow. Sleep tight. There were also beliefs about how you lit a candle. Using a splinter from the hearth was normal. But lighting one from another candle? Some said that was bad luck. Others said it transferred blessings. Nobody agreed, which is classic superstition. You're never sure if you're doing something lucky or summoning a demon. And then there were candle charms. Girls might drip melted wax into cold water and watch the shapes to predict who they'd marry. Spoiler, it usually just looked like blobs. But with enough imagination, anything could resemble a heart, a face, or, if you were unlucky, an ominous coffin shape. Very relaxing. Holiday traditions also leaned heavily on candles. Christmas was the big one. Families who could afford it would light bayberry candles on Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve. There was a rhyme, a bayberry candle burned to the socket brings luck to the house and gold to the pocket. Basically, your standard burn this expensive wax and maybe you won't be broke next year kind of charm. And because bayberry candles smelled amazing, at least you got something out of it, even if your pocket remained tragically gold-free. Candlelit church services were another huge tradition during holidays. Nothing like packing the whole town into a drafty meeting house, lighting beeswax tapers, and praying for several hours while trying not to nod off. For many, the candlelit glow was the most beautiful sight of the season. Soft light, hymns, and a brief moment of warmth in an otherwise cold, muddy winter. Unless you were sitting in the back row with only a sputtering tallow stub, in which case you probably just thought about stew the whole time. And let's not forget Halloween, or rather, colonial America's version of autumn spookiness. Pumpkins weren't as big a deal yet, but people did carve turnips and stick candles inside them. Yes, a candlelit turnip lantern. Imagine walking at night and seeing that glowing in the distance. Forget ghosts, that alone would terrify you. There were also stories about using candles to ward off witches. Place one in a window, and supposedly no evil could enter, unless the wind blew it out, in which case, congratulations, your house was officially cursed. Birthdays sometimes involved candles too, though not like the frosted cake version we know now. More often, it was about lighting an extra taper in thanks, or hope, for another year of survival. Because, let's face it, if you made it to 40 in colonial America, you were practically ancient. And then there was death. Funerals and mourning rituals leaned heavily on candlelight. A room with a body would often have candles burning around it, symbolizing the soul's passage and keeping away dark spirits. Candles were also lit on anniversaries of deaths, giving families a ritual way to remember. Though, honestly, they probably also doubled as a polite excuse to get through another tallow stash. Of course, all of this superstition and symbolism had a practical side too. A candle wasn't just a candle, it was time, safety, memory, and sometimes hope. It gave meaning to long winters and a little structure to the endless dark. Even if half the meanings were contradictory, at least it kept people entertained. And so, when we picture colonial nights, we shouldn't just imagine dull practicality. Picture the quiet thrill of watching a flame gutter and wondering if it meant something. Imagine families huddled around a bayberry candle on Christmas Eve, whispering that old rhyme. Picture a turnip lantern glowing faintly in the field, or a girl pouring wax into a bowl, squinting to see if she'd just predicted eternal spinsterhood. It's a world where the ordinary, just a bit of light, was also the extraordinary, and where something as simple as tallow could become a doorway to mystery. So, next time your candle flickers at night, just remember, it's probably just the air conditioning. But hey, maybe don't think too hard about it. So far, we've talked about candles in homes, in taverns, in churches, and even in spooky midnight rituals. But now let's float over to the people who made a living out of all this waxy business. Because yes, in colonial America, there were professional candlemakers. And no, it wasn't the most glamorous job on the resume. These professionals were known as chandlers. And chandlers weren't exactly the rock stars of the town. They were more like the background technicians who kept everything running while smelling faintly of beef fat all day. Their shops, called chandleries, were equal parts workshop, storefront, and storage room filled with racks of drying candles. Walking into one wasn't like stepping into a modern candle boutique with relaxing spa music and soy wax in frosted jars. No, a chandlery in the 1700s probably smelled like a mix of wet sheep, boiled fat, and faint desperation. Not exactly aromatherapy. Still, people needed light, so chandlers were indispensable. The trade itself was demanding. Candle making meant hours of heating tallow, dipping wicks, cooling, repeating, trimming, pouring, and molding. And of course, you had to keep the ratios right. Too much fat and the candle smoked like a chimney. Too little and it burned out halfway through supper. Customers complained, and in small towns, word spread fast. Nobody wanted to be known as the chandler who made fun-size candles. Apprenticeships were common. Boys, or sometimes unlucky relatives, would be sent to work under a master chandler, learning the art of not burning the shop down while handling hot vats of grease. Apprentices did all the worst jobs, like cleaning the equipment, trimming endless wicks, or hauling barrels of tallow that smelled worse with every passing summer day. Honestly, it's surprising more apprentices didn't run away to sea. And let's not forget the supply chain. A candlemaker was only as good as their access to fat, wax, and wicks. Farmers sold tallow from slaughtered animals. Beekeepers provided beeswax, usually saving the best comb for churches or rich clients. Wicks were often made of cotton or hemp, imported in bulk if the colony was fancy enough, or cobbled together from local fibers if not. In other words, chandlers lived at the mercy of other people's leftovers. Of course, Candles weren't cheap. A good beeswax candle could cost several times more than a tallow one. This made chandlers part of the early colonial luxury economy, supplying the wealthy with honey-scented illumination while everyone else squinted at their greasy tapers. If you wanted to show off your status, forget buying jewelry. Just burn a few beeswax candles casually at dinner. It was the 18th century equivalent of flexing a gold watch. Chandlers also dabbled in soap making, since both trades involved boiling fat and trying not to gag. This dual business model meant more profit, but also double the stink. One day you'd be pouring soap molds, the next you'd be dipping candles, all while hoping customers didn't confuse which product they were supposed to light on fire. Interestingly, candle trade records survive in colonial inventories and wills. When someone died, their estate might list 12 tallow candles or 3 pounds beeswax. Yes, even in death, people's candles were carefully counted and divided up. Imagine passing down your precious wax stashed to your children like it was family silver. And chandlers themselves weren't always small-town artisans. In port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston, chandlers could grow into serious merchants, importing wax, trading supplies, and shipping products to other colonies. Light was a commodity, and someone had to corner the market. Nothing says power like controlling how many hours your neighbors get to stay awake after sunset. Of course, it wasn't all glamorous expansion. There were regulations too. Colonial governments sometimes imposed taxes on imported beeswax or tried to regulate the quality of candles sold. Because apparently, even in the 1700s, politicians were micromanaging how bright your living room could be. And here's a little irony. While chandlers made their living selling candles, most people still made their own at home when they could. A professional candle was better quality, but not everyone could afford them regularly. So the chandlery was more like a backup plan, when your own stash ran out, or when you needed something fancier for a wedding, a funeral, or the governor's visit. Which meant chandlers lived in this weird space between necessity and luxury, always hoping their neighbors' DIY candles sputtered out early. The life of a chandler wasn't heroic, but it was steady. People always needed light. And while nobody was writing ballads about the local candle merchant, they were, quite literally, the ones who kept the town glowing. Meanwhile, far from battlefields and grumbling kings, the story takes us upward, high into the Andes. A world of mountains, valleys, and cliffs so steep it feels like gravity itself holds a personal grudge. And the people who made this landscape home? The Incas. Masters of stonework, empire building, and, most importantly for this part of the tale, the art of stringing a bunch of grass across a canyon and calling it a bridge. Yes, rope bridges. The original hold your breath and hope method of crossing rivers. The Inca Empire, stretching thousands of miles across mountains, deserts, and jungles, had no wheels, no horses, and no iron. But they had these things, delicate, swaying, woven bridges made from plants. And somehow, they worked. They connected villages, armies, and traders across gorges so deep that even the thought of looking down would make you want to lie flat on the ground and rethink your life choices. Now, picture it, a traveler in the 1500s, making his way along the Royal Inca road system. He comes to the edge of a canyon. There's a river roaring hundreds of feet below. The only way across. A woven rope bridge, swaying gently in the wind, each step creaking with the weight of your life decisions. And yes, people did this all the time. Farmers, soldiers, runners carrying messages, they all just casually walked across what looks to us like a nightmare scenario. Meanwhile, I can barely cross a rickety dock at the lake without clinging to the nearest railing. The materials were simple. Grass, reeds, and sometimes maguey fiber, twisted and braided into ropes as thick as your arm. Villagers wove them together into cables, then stretched them across chasms, anchoring each end to massive stone supports. Then came the handrails, because apparently, even in the 1400s, someone said, "You know what would be nice? Not dying." The floor was made of smaller ropes lashed together into a sort of lattice walkway. Functional, if not exactly OSHA approved. And here's the thing, these weren't permanent. The bridges had to be replaced every year or two. Grass rots. Fibers weaken. Which meant the bridges were constantly being renewed in massive communal projects. Whole villages turned out, braiding new ropes, singing, eating, and turning it into something between an engineering feat and a festival. Imagine if your annual neighborhood block party involved suspending a new death trap over a canyon. But for the Incas, it wasn't terrifying, it was normal. Their empire thrived on connections, and those rope bridges were lifelines. They allowed armies to march, messages to be carried, and food to reach markets. Without them, the empire simply wouldn't have held together. In other words, forget Machu Picchu for a second. These wobbly, swaying bridges were the true backbone of Inca infrastructure. Now, let's take a second to appreciate how different this was from European engineering of the same period. While the Spanish were busy building chunky stone bridges that took decades and massive resources, the Incas were casually braiding grass into suspension bridges that could stretch hundreds of feet. Light, flexible, renewable, eco-friendly before it was cool. Of course, you had to really trust your neighbor's braiding skills, but still, it worked. And here's where the Spanish come in, of course. When they first encountered these rope bridges in the 1500s, their reactions were, let's just say, skeptical. Some crossed them bravely. Others flat out refused. Horses had to be blindfolded and coaxed across, which, if you've ever tried to convince a stubborn horse to do anything, sounds like a recipe for disaster. Picture conquistadors in heavy armor, clutching the rope handrails, muttering prayers, while Andean farmers just strolled past with baskets of potatoes like it was no big deal. But while Europeans built to last centuries, the Inca system was more about rhythm. Bridges decayed, but that was fine, because the community rebuilt them together. It wasn't just infrastructure, it was tradition. And that's part of what made it work. The empire didn't need one monumental bridge. It needed dozens, hundreds, woven and rewoven every season like the living veins of the Andes. So, as we begin this slow journey tonight, imagine yourself there, standing at the edge of a canyon in Peru, the wind tugging at your clothes, a rope bridge swaying gently in front of you. Below, the river crashes endlessly, as if it's waiting for you to slip. Behind you, the sun is setting over the mountains. And in front of you, just a handful of grass ropes. That was life in the Inca world, dangerous, practical, and oddly beautiful. And yes, we're just getting started. So, let's not stop at just one bridge. Because these things weren't isolated party tricks scattered here and there. They were part of a much bigger picture, the Inca road system. And this road system? It was legendary. Think of it as the Wi-Fi of the ancient Andes, except instead of being patchy in tunnels, it was patchy in, well, giant mountains. The Inca Empire, at its height, stretched about 2,500 miles north to south. That's basically the distance from New York to Los Angeles. But, add in mountains, deserts, jungles, and rivers that look like they'd happily swallow your soul. Yet somehow, the Incas managed to knit it all together with about 25,000 miles of roads. 25,000. And we're not talking highways. These were narrow paths carved into cliffs, paved stone routes through valleys, and, of course, rope bridges spanning places no sensible human would want to cross. And who used these roads? Everybody. Farmers driving llamas loaded with potatoes. Traders carrying textiles. Soldiers marching in neat, terrifying rows. And most famously, runners. The chasquis. These were young men trained to sprint at high altitudes, carrying messages, goods, and even fresh fish from the coast to inland cities hundreds of miles away. The system worked like a relay race. A runner would sprint a few miles, hand off the message or goods, and the next runner would take over. In this way, news could travel astonishing distances in just a few days. Imagine it, a fresh fish caught in the Pacific could, through this human relay, end up on the table of the emperor in Cusco before it went bad. That's efficiency. Meanwhile, in Europe, kings were still relying on some poor guy on horseback to take a week to deliver a single letter, probably getting distracted by ale along the way. The Inca postal system, powered by legs and rope bridges, was honestly better. Now, about those bridges. Runners had to cross them constantly. Day, night, rain, wind, it didn't matter. And keep in mind, they were carrying quipu sometimes, those knotted cords that served as the empire's record-keeping system. Dropping one of those into a canyon? Not ideal. So crossing a rope bridge wasn't just about balance. It was about not being the guy who lost the empire's accounting records into the Urubamba River. And speaking of armies, yes, the Inca military used these routes too. Tens of thousands of soldiers could move through the mountains with shocking speed, thanks to the roads and bridges. Imagine an army snaking its way along a narrow mountain pass, then reaching a gorge where the only option was a rope bridge swaying in the wind. Did they all just queue up politely and march across? Kind of. In practice, soldiers crossed in smaller groups to avoid overloading the bridge, which sounds sensible until you realize how long that must have taken. War, but with mandatory lines, every general's dream. The roads also connected to way stations, or tambos, placed every few miles. These were rest stops for travelers, with food, water, and supplies. Think of them as the Colonial Andes version of a gas station, minus the questionable hot dogs. Runners relied on them, armies stocked up there, and travelers found a place to light a small fire and not freeze overnight. And all of these tambos depended on the bridges to keep goods moving. For ordinary people, though, crossing these bridges was just a fact of life. A farmer heading to market might cross with a bundle of maize on his back. A woman traveling to visit relatives might balance carefully with her child slung in a blanket. It wasn't some rare daredevil stunt, it was Tuesday. And that's the part that's hardest for us to wrap our heads around. For us, dangling over a canyon on a handful of woven grass sounds like a nightmare. For them, it was just infrastructure. Now, let's not pretend it was all smooth sailing, or smooth walking, rather. Accidents happened. Bridges snapped. Storms damaged cables. And sometimes people didn't make it across. The empire kept records of rebuilding and maintaining them precisely because failure was always an option. But here's the thing, the system was so well organized that if a bridge failed, it was rebuilt almost immediately by local communities. Imagine if your interstate highway collapsed and your neighbors just showed up the next morning with tools, grass, and good intentions. And of course, crossing wasn't free of fear. Spanish chroniclers noted that some locals would crawl across on hands and knees rather than walk upright, which, honestly, feels relatable. Better to look ridiculous than plummet a few hundred feet. But kids, animals, and traders crossed every day. If anyone was terrified, they didn't have the luxury of avoiding it. So, in the Inca world, these bridges weren't marvels or curiosities, they were arteries. They tied the empire together, let information race across mountains, and allowed life to flow where otherwise there'd just be silence and impassable cliffs. Let's pause and imagine again, the sound of sandals on woven fiber, the bridge creaking under weight, the river roaring below, the wind pulling at your cloak. And you keep walking, because there's no other way across. That's life in the empire of the rope bridges. So, the Inca world is humming along. Bridges swaying, runners sprinting, armies marching, everyone pretending this is normal. And then, of course, the Spanish show up. Because it wouldn't be a proper 16th century story without a handful of armored men wandering in and immediately making things complicated. Picture this, Spanish conquistadors, fresh from crossing the ocean, armed with steel, horses, and a hefty dose of arrogance. They were used to stone bridges, Roman leftovers, or at least a nice wooden plank situation. What they were not used to was walking up to the edge of a canyon and seeing grass ropes stretched across a bottomless void. Their reaction? Absolute horror. Chroniclers wrote about this. Men froze at the edge, staring at the bridge like it was the devil's hammock. Some flat out refused to cross. Others had to be coaxed onto it like nervous cats. And the horses? Forget it. Horses wanted nothing to do with a swaying rope path. They had to be blindfolded, pushed, or sometimes ferried across rivers instead. Which is just a wonderful mental picture. Proud conquistadors, supposedly conquerors of empires, reduced to dragging a stubborn horse toward a bridge while local farmers strolled across carrying baskets of corn like it was nothing. But here's the irony. For all their bravado, the Spanish quickly realized they needed these bridges. The Inca Empire was too vast, too mountainous, and too dependent on its rope highways to be conquered without them. If the Spanish wanted to march troops, move loot, or send messages, they had to swallow their fear and step onto the grass. And step they did, clutching the rope handrails, muttering prayers, and probably regretting every life decision that had led them to this moment. There are stories of Spaniards dismantling some of the bridges to prevent Inca armies from using them, only to find themselves stranded later. Which, honestly, feels like classic colonial karma. Destroy the thing you don't understand, then realize you actually needed it all along. And let's just pause here for the comedy of contrasts. On one side, Spanish soldiers in gleaming armor, trying to look intimidating but secretly terrified of falling. On the other, Andean farmers, barefoot, crossing with llamas in tow, not even breaking a sweat. The whole scene must have been one long humiliation for the conquistadors. Imagine being God's chosen conqueror and still needing a local teenager to explain how not to die on a bridge. Of course, the Spanish being the Spanish, they eventually adapted. They used the bridges, rebuilt them when necessary, and sometimes even forced local communities to maintain them for their benefit. But the fear never really went away. Even decades later, Europeans described crossing Inca rope bridges with phrases like a peril to the soul or a miracle of human audacity. Meanwhile, the locals were just annoyed at the extra traffic. And to be fair, it wasn't only the Spanish. Other Europeans who traveled through the Andes later also described the bridges with a mix of awe and terror. Some compared them to spiderwebs. Others said they swayed like ships at sea. The idea of hundreds of feet of empty air beneath your sandals was universally unsettling, unless you'd grown up with it, in which case it was just Monday morning. But this moment, the collision of European steel and Andean grass, is one of those strange little ironies of history. The conquerors, armed with cannons and cavalry, were utterly dependent on fragile ropes braided by villagers. The empire they toppled still held them up, literally, step by shaky step. So, imagine the scene again, a line of conquistadors shuffling across, armor clanking, muttering prayers, while the wind tugs at the ropes. Below, the river thunders. Ahead, more mountains. And behind them, a smirking farmer who just crossed faster than you tied your shoelaces. That's the Spanish invasion, rope bridge edition. So, here's the thing about rope bridges, they don't last forever. Grass frays, fibers rot, rain seeps in, and wind does its worst. In the Andes, a bridge might be solid for a year, maybe two, before it needed replacing. Which meant the Inca bridges weren't monuments like Roman aqueducts, standing stoically for centuries. They were living things, born, used, and reborn again. And that's where the rebuilding came in. Every year, entire communities would gather to remake the bridge. And it wasn't just a handful of workers, it was everyone. Men, women, children, elders, llamas probably wandering in the background. The whole village turned out. Because these bridges weren't just for travelers or armies, they were the veins of the Andes. If you wanted to get to market, visit relatives, or send a message to Cusco, you needed that bridge. The process was meticulous. First, old ropes were cut down, sometimes ceremonially tossed into the river below. Then villagers began braiding new ropes. This wasn't a quick job. We're talking days of twisting grass into cords, cords into cables, cables into massive thick lines strong enough to carry people and animals across a canyon. Everyone contributed. Kids twisted smaller cords, women braided mid-sized ropes, men worked on the thickest cables. It was an act of collective patience. And of course, it wasn't just labor, it was ritual. Songs were sung. Prayers were offered to the apis, the mountain spirits. Food and chicha, the local maize beer, were shared. Imagine it, the smell of roasting corn, the sound of chanting, the steady rhythm of hundreds of hands braiding fibers together. Engineering and spirituality tied in a single knot. Once the ropes were ready, the real fun began. Teams on either side of the gorge anchored the main cables into stone abutments, massive carved blocks designed to hold against centuries of weight and weather. Then came the terrifying part, sending brave souls out onto the half-finished bridge to lash everything into place. Picture being the first one crawling onto dangling ropes above a roaring river, carrying bundles of fiber to tie the whole thing together. Brave, or maybe just the unlucky apprentice. Slowly, the structure came together, the footpath ropes, the side rails, the smaller lashings woven in crisscross patterns. By the end, what had been an empty gap was once again a swaying but solid path. And when it was finally complete, the whole community celebrated. Feasting, music, dancing, all to mark the fact that they could once again cross safely. And here's what's remarkable, this tradition lasted for centuries. Even after the fall of the Inca Empire, local communities kept rebuilding their bridges. Spanish officials occasionally tried to step in, sometimes using the bridges for their own needs, sometimes letting them fall into neglect, but the villagers kept at it anyway. Because for them, it wasn't optional. It was survival, culture, and pride woven into one. Even today, in a few places in Peru, the tradition continues. The most famous is the Huachaca Bridge, rebuilt every June by 4 Quechua communities. It's the last surviving Inca rope bridge still renewed annually. And the process? Pretty much the same as it was centuries ago. Grass harvested, braided, ropes hauled, cables anchored, villagers chanting and weaving until the gap is closed again. Then a festival. Then feasting. Then, finally, a shaky but functional bridge that tourists and locals alike can cross, if they dare. Think about that for a moment. In a world of steel, asphalt, and GPS, there are still people braiding grass ropes to keep alive a tradition older than any cathedral in Europe. Not as monuments, not as relics, but as living, working infrastructure. So, these bridges weren't just technology. They were community. A literal weaving together of lives, generation after generation. And when you crossed one, you weren't just stepping on rope. You were stepping on the combined work, faith, and rhythm of an entire people. Now, let's float for a moment and picture it. Hundreds of villagers, mountains towering around them, the wind carrying the smell of smoke and grass, the sound of rope creaking under tension as the final knots are tied. And then, silence. A new bridge sways gently in the breeze, ready for the next year. That's not just engineering. That's poetry in fiber. So, the bridges kept swaying. Even after the Inca Empire collapsed under Spanish steel and disease, those woven lifelines stayed. Because here's the truth, the Spanish might have toppled the rulers, but they couldn't topple gravity. You still had to get across the canyons. And if you didn't want to spend a week marching around them, you needed the rope bridges. Which meant, ironically, the conquerors who once mocked these things now depended on them. Colonial administrators used them to collect tribute. Missionaries crossed them to reach far-flung villages. Soldiers marched over them, still muttering prayers under their breath. In a way, the bridges became the quiet backbone of the new colonial order, the Spanish Empire running on Inca technology it had never bothered to fully understand. But, as with all things colonial, exploitation wasn't far behind. Communities were still required to rebuild the bridges, but now it was framed as labor tribute to the crown. What had once been a sacred festival of community became another box to check in the endless grind of colonial obligations. The songs and rituals never disappeared, but there was always a priest or an official watching, making sure the infrastructure got finished on schedule. There's something darkly funny in this, if you tilt your head. The Spanish built massive cathedrals and government palaces, all stone and grandeur, but when it came to actually moving around their new empire, they had to trust villagers braiding grass. Imagine a governor striding through Cusco in velvet robes, then squealing like a frightened child while crossing a swaying bridge because some farmer's knots held his life in balance. Power looks different when the ground beneath you is made of rope. And of course, symbolism crept in. To the Spanish, the bridges became both marvels and metaphors. They wrote about them as symbols of the strange, precarious world of the Andes. Some called them miracles of ingenuity, others, hazards of barbarous people. It depended on whether the chronicler had successfully made it across that week or not. For local communities, the symbolism was different. Rebuilding the bridge each year became a quiet act of resistance, a way of holding onto tradition under the eye of empire. The Spanish might take their land, their gold, their labor, but the bridge was still theirs. Still woven from their hands, still standing in the wind. It was one place where Andean rhythm survived, disguised as utility. Travelers in the colonial period kept writing about these crossings. Priests, merchants, bureaucrats, they all recorded the mixture of awe and fear they felt dangling over canyons. Some even tried to improve the bridges by adding planks or wooden reinforcements, because Europeans never met an indigenous technology they didn't want to fix. But the basic structure remained stubbornly Andean. Grass, rope, hands, songs. And by the 18th century, the bridges had become almost mythic in European imagination. Drawings of them circulated, with captions about the perils of Peru. Enlightenment thinkers wrote about them as evidence of both human ingenuity and human folly. In salons in Paris, people sipped chocolate and marveled at the idea of villagers in the Andes dangling over abysses on ropes, as though this was the most exotic thing imaginable. Meanwhile, the villagers themselves just shrugged and kept crossing. There's something quietly poetic about that. The Spanish could reshape governments, redraw maps, impose new gods, but when they looked out across a canyon, they still saw the same thing the Incas had seen, a gap that only rope could bridge. And every year, despite empire and exploitation, the community kept weaving. So, these bridges weren't just infrastructure anymore. They were symbols. For the Spanish, of conquest and strangeness. For the Andean people, of survival and continuity. And for us, looking back, they're a reminder that history isn't only written in stone. Sometimes it sways in the wind, frays at the edges, and is reborn every year by the hands of people who refused to let it vanish. Let's pause there. Picture again the colonial governor, sweating through his finery, inching across a bridge woven by the very people he claimed to rule. That's politics in the Andes, fragile, swaying, and never quite as secure as it looked on paper. Time moves on, empires rise and fall, and even the strongest rope eventually frays. By the late colonial period, many of the famous Inca bridges began to vanish. Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but slowly, quietly. A little like old traditions everywhere, they fade not because they're useless, but because the world changes around them. The Spanish built stone bridges where they could, especially in valleys near major towns. Roads were redirected. Trade shifted. And for every new stone arch that spanned a river, an old rope bridge was left to rot. Some fell into disuse, others simply collapsed one day and were never replaced. By the 19th century, many travelers noted that the once dense network of woven crossings had thinned to just a handful. Part of the decline was simple practicality. With independence movements reshaping South America and new nations forming, governments wanted infrastructure that looked modern. Stone, steel, and eventually railways, these were the marks of progress. A grass bridge, however functional, looked like a relic of a primitive past. And nothing says progress like ignoring centuries of perfectly good engineering because it doesn't match your aesthetic. But there was also something stubborn about the rope bridges. They refused to vanish completely. Some survived because local communities kept them alive. In remote areas where no stone bridge could realistically be built, villagers still gathered every year to braid new ropes and string them across gorges. Not for nostalgia. Not even for tradition at first. Simply because they needed them. If you wanted to reach pasture on the other side, or get to market, or visit a cousin in the next valley, you still had to cross. Travelers in the 19th century sometimes stumbled on these survivors. They wrote about them in letters and journals with the same mixture of awe and terror as the conquistadors centuries earlier. Some described the bridges as quaint remnants of a bygone empire. Others painted them as symbols of romantic ruin, the Andes holding onto its secrets against the tide of progress. The locals, meanwhile, didn't think of them as ruins. They were just bridges, still useful, still rebuilt, still swaying in the wind. And yet, one by one, most of them disappeared. Roads were paved. Modern suspension bridges went up. Cars replaced llamas. The few rope bridges that remained became curiosities, talked about, occasionally visited, but increasingly rare. By the mid-20th century, only a handful were left, hanging on more by tradition than by necessity. It's here where memory takes over. The rope bridges became symbols not of empire, but of endurance. Writers, photographers, and eventually tourists sought them out. They wanted to see this fragile thing that had once held together an empire. And in seeking, they sometimes helped preserve. Communities realized that what had once been ordinary was now extraordinary. That their yearly braiding was no longer just survival, but heritage. The Huachuca Bridge is the most famous example, the last of the Inca rope bridges still rebuilt annually. Every June, 4 communities in Peru come together, just as their ancestors did, to weave the ropes, anchor the cables, and span the gorge. They sing. They feast. They tie knots that hold both history and future. And when it's done, the bridge sways once more in the wind, a living museum piece you can actually walk across, if your nerves allow it. The fact that it survives at all feels like defiance. In a world of concrete and steel, a bundle of braided grass insists that it still matters. That memory isn't just written in books or carved in stone, but woven in fiber, renewed year after year. And maybe that's the strange beauty of their decline. Yes, most of the bridges are gone, but the ones that remain carry more weight than stone ever could. They remind us that fragility and strength aren't opposites, that sometimes the most precarious things last longest, not because they resist change, but because they bend, fray, and are reborn. So, when we think of the Inca bridges today, we're not really thinking of infrastructure. We're thinking of ghosts. Of travelers long gone, armies long vanished, empires long collapsed, all of them carried once across ropes swaying above a river. The bridges are memory stretched across a canyon, and every gust of wind through their fibers is a whisper from that forgotten world. So here we are, at the final stretch. The bridges of the Incas are mostly gone, but not forgotten. And the ones that remain, rare, fragile, swaying, carry more than just people across a gorge. They carry memory. In the modern era, these bridges have become part of Peru's cultural identity. Scholars study them. Tourists travel to see them. UNESCO even lists the tradition of rebuilding the Huachuca Bridge as part of the world's intangible cultural heritage. Which, let's be honest, is a fancy way of saying, hey, please don't let this disappear. And it hasn't. Each June, villagers gather in the high Andes to cut grass, braid ropes, and sing the old songs. They anchor new cables, lash the sides, and lay down the walkway. Tourists and cameras hover nearby, but the heart of it isn't performance. It's survival disguised as tradition, or maybe tradition disguised as survival. The bridge is both. And when it's done, the villagers cross first, showing that the work is sound. Then the curious outsiders follow, clinging to the rails, laughing nervously, their sneakers squeaking on ropes that have carried generations. For modern Peruvians, the bridge is more than a tourist attraction. It's a link, literally, to the world of their ancestors. It's proof that the Inca genius wasn't just about stones and terraces, but about community, ritual, and rhythm. That the empire wasn't held together only by kings and armies, but by hands braiding grass, year after year. And for the rest of us, far from the Andes, the bridges have become something softer. Symbols in photographs, stories in books, quiet metaphors about connection. Writers love to use them. The bridge is the span between past and present, between cultures, between the fragile and the eternal. Poets, of course, can't resist comparing a rope bridge to human life. Swaying, precarious, beautiful in its tension. A little melodramatic, maybe, but not wrong. Think about it. A bundle of grass, braided and woven, holds more strength than anyone expects. It bends with the wind, sways with the storm, frays, and eventually gives way. But then it is reborn, because a community decides it matters. There's something profoundly human in that. So tonight, as we wind down, let's imagine once more. You're standing in the Andes. The air is thin and cold. Below you, a river carves endlessly through stone. Before you, a bridge sways gently, nothing but woven grass and rope. You step onto it. The fibers creak, the wind hums, the water roars faintly far below. But you keep walking. Slowly, calmly, one foot in front of the other. And when you reach the other side, you don't look back with fear. You look back with quiet wonder, because somehow, the bridge held. It always did. And it always will, as long as hands keep braiding and voices keep singing. Meanwhile, far from the troubles of kings and collapsing dynasties, the story shifts to somewhere much drier. And I mean that literally, to Persia. The desert. Endless sun, dry air, and heat so intense it makes you wonder if you've somehow offended the gods themselves. And in this shimmering landscape stands one of the most quietly brilliant inventions of the ancient world, the wind tower. Yes, a tower. That catches wind. Sounds simple, right? But this wasn't some quirky design fad. This was survival. Because living in a Persian desert city without shade, breeze, or water storage was basically a recipe for instant crankiness, dehydration, and death, though probably not in that order. And yet, people managed. They didn't just survive. They thrived. With the help of a tall, elegant, oddly beautiful bit of architecture that worked like ancient air conditioning. So, let's set the scene. Imagine a city in central Persia, maybe Yazd, famous for its desert landscapes and buildings that shimmer in the heat. Narrow streets to keep out the sun, courtyards with little pools of water, domed rooftops reflecting the light. And towering above them, these strange chimneys. Tall, slender, rising like watchful sentinels. Except they're not chimneys. They are wind catchers. Badgers, as they were called. Which, in a delightfully blunt translation, means wind catcher. And that's exactly what they did. Hot desert wind blows. The tower scoops it up. Inside, clever little channels direct that air down into the house below. Sometimes the breeze flows over a pool of water, cooling it further. Sometimes it passes through underground chambers, making the air even chillier. Either way, you've just taken something as simple as wind and turned it into comfort. Without electricity. Without machines. Without paying a shocking summer energy bill. And before you picture some clunky contraption, know this, these things were elegant. Rectangular or octagonal towers, decorated with delicate arches, carved stone, patterned brickwork. Function married to beauty. Because of course, in the Persian world, even your air conditioning had to be stylish. Now, the brilliance wasn't just in catching wind, but in knowing how to catch it. Builders oriented the towers based on local winds. Some had 4 openings to capture breezes from any direction. Others had multiple compartments, so no matter which way the wind shifted, cool air was always delivered. It's like they thought, well, if the desert insists on trying to kill us, we might as well make it work for us instead. And this wasn't just for wealthy merchants showing off. Wind towers appeared on houses, mosques, bazaars, even ice houses. Yes, ice houses. Because as if creating desert air conditioning wasn't enough, Persians also figured out how to store literal ice in the desert. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll drift to those chilly vaults later. Back to our towers. Inside the homes, the effect was remarkable. You'd step in from the blazing courtyard, the sun baking your clothes, and suddenly, a cool draft wrapped around you. The kind of breeze that feels like the earth itself is exhaling. Guests would sit cross-legged on carpets, sipping tea, talking politics, or gossiping about which neighbor's badger wasn't working properly. Because yes, even 800 years ago, your HVAC system was something to brag about. But let's not romanticize too much. These towers weren't magic. They didn't create cold like modern AC. They worked best when paired with qanats, underground water channels that carried melted snow from mountains into desert towns. Air passing over cool water in a basement chamber made all the difference. Without that water, a wind tower was still useful, but not luxurious. So, half the brilliance here was architecture, the other half was plumbing. And together, they turned cities that should have been unlivable into thriving centers of trade and culture. The Spanish might have had their cathedrals, the French their chateaux. But the Persians? They had wind towers. Practical, elegant, and honestly more useful than a spire that just points to the heavens. Unless the heavens were sending you a breeze, the tower had already done the job better. And like most clever inventions, nobody gave them enough credit outside Persia. European travelers would pass through, marvel at the structures, scribble a note in their journals about strange towers funneling wind, and then promptly ignore them. Because apparently, cooling yourself without coal smoke or steam engines wasn't impressive enough for the Enlightenment. But the Persians knew. They lived with them daily. They built them taller, more intricate, sometimes clustering them so whole districts shimmered with breezes. And they passed down the skill from generation to generation. Masons knew exactly how to angle the vents, how wide to make the shafts, how to balance beauty with airflow. It was both science and art, wrapped in clay and brick. So tonight, picture it. You're in a desert courtyard, walls high around you, a pool of water glimmering in the center. Above, the wind tower catches a current. Air slides down, cool, steady, wrapping you like a sigh. Outside, the heat shimmers. Inside, calm settles. You sip tea. You listen to the rustle of wind in stone. You forget, for a moment, that the desert was ever trying to roast you alive. That's the quiet miracle of the badger. Ancient Persia, catching breezes in the desert heat. So, we've climbed the tower, felt the wind slide down, and marveled at how Persians basically invented eco-friendly air conditioning before most of Europe had figured out how to stop throwing chamber pots into the street. But what did life actually look like under these towers? What did a summer evening feel like when your house was literally designed to breathe? Step inside a home in Yazd or Kashan. The door closes behind you, the noise of the street fades, and suddenly you're in a courtyard. That courtyard isn't decoration. It's the soul of the house. Rectangular, shaded, lined with rooms on all sides, and in the middle, always, a pool of water. Not Olympic size, obviously, but big enough to reflect the sky and ripple when the wind hits it. Plants edge the sides, pomegranate trees maybe, a vine climbing up a wall. And above all this rises the wind tower, its openings catching the faintest currents and guiding them down into the rooms. Daily life orbited this courtyard. Families ate here, children played, guests were entertained. On summer nights, bedding was carried out so people could sleep under the stars, lulled by cool drafts filtering down from the tower. And because privacy mattered, the walls were high, cutting off the view from outside. The world beyond might be sun-scorched and noisy, but inside, it was calm, shaded, and always a little breezy. Now, the clever part wasn't just the wind tower. It was the whole system. Rooms were arranged so some caught morning sun, others caught evening shade. Basements, called sardabs, were dug beneath the courtyard. These were the real treasures in summer. The wind tower funneled air down into these underground spaces, often across a channel of water from a qanat. Step inside, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Some sardabs were so cool you could store food there, or just collapse in relief when the heat outside felt unbearable. And of course, status crept in. Wealthier families had taller wind towers, bigger courtyards, and multiple sardabs. Nothing says, "I'm successful," like having a private breeze on demand. Guests would sip sherbet made with snow from distant mountains. Yes, carried down along qanats or stored in ice pits, and discuss poetry, trade, or which neighbor's tower looked suspiciously crooked. Because even in the 15th century, neighborhood rivalry was alive and well. The social customs wrapped themselves around this architecture. Afternoons were for retreating indoors, letting the wind tower do its work while the city outside fell into drowsy silence. Evening brought people back out into courtyards, gossip flowing as easily as tea. Stories were told, prayers recited, children scolded for climbing too close to the pool. Life felt measured, steady, and shaped by the rhythm of air. Even mosques and bazaars weren't exempt. Imagine stepping into a prayer hall cooled by a tall wind tower, the air circulating gently as rows of worshippers recited verses. Or wandering through a marketplace where the thick heat of spices and bodies was tempered, just slightly, by drafts slipping in from above. It wasn't luxury, it was necessity, but it also made life possible in places that otherwise would have been unbearable. And here's where I can't help but laugh a little. Europe, at this same time, was still figuring out how to build chimneys that didn't smoke everyone out of the living room. Meanwhile, in Persia, families were lounging in underground cooled rooms, sipping chilled drinks, fanning themselves lazily as the desert sun blazed outside. Sometimes advanced civilization doesn't look like castles and knights. Sometimes it looks like a basement with really good airflow. Of course, there were quirks. The system wasn't perfect. Dust storms could funnel in, filling your house with sand if you weren't careful. Towers had to be cleaned and maintained, which meant someone had to climb up and check ropes, plaster, and openings. And if the wind wasn't cooperating, well, then you just sat in the shade and grumbled about it, which, to be fair, is still pretty relatable. But overall, life under the wind towers was a rhythm of balance. Work early in the morning, hide in the shade at midday, retreat underground when it was hottest, emerge at night to enjoy the cool air and stars. The architecture didn't just provide comfort, it shaped how people lived, when they moved, when they gathered, when they rested. So tonight, picture yourself there. A hot afternoon fading into evening. Carpets spread in the courtyard, a tray of fruit set out, figs, melons, maybe a pomegranate cracked open. The tower hums faintly above, sending down a lazy stream of air. A child laughs, water ripples in the pool, and the smell of bread drifts from the kitchen. The city outside is still and glowing with heat, but here, under the wind tower, life is cool, calm, and quietly perfect. So far, we've been lounging in shady courtyards and basking in breezy towers. But the real magic of Persian cooling wasn't just the air above, it was the water below. Because in the middle of a desert, water is everything. And the Persians, being annoyingly clever, didn't just find ways to move water underground. They found ways to store ice. Yes, ice. In the desert. Without electricity. Honestly, they made modern refrigerators look a little overrated. Let's start with the Qanat. Imagine an underground tunnel, gently sloping from the mountains all the way to a town or village. Melted snow from high peaks seeped into the ground, and these tunnels carried it across miles of desert. No pumps, no pipes, just gravity doing all the work. On the surface, you'd see a line of vertical shafts, like mysterious holes in the ground, stretching across the desert. That was the sign of a Qanat running below, silently carrying life into the city. Now, combine that with a wind tower. Air rushed down the tower, passed over a Qanat channel in a basement room, and cooled instantly. The result? An underground chamber that felt several degrees cooler than the oven-like heat above. People used these spaces to rest, to store food, even to keep wine or sherbets cool. Imagine stepping into one after a long day outside. The air crisp, the faint trickle of water echoing, the heat forgotten. It was a kind of desert magic, except it was just physics and patience. But the Qanats weren't enough for some people. Oh no. The Persians went further. They built ice houses. Huge, dome-shaped structures made of thick mud brick, often connected to wind towers. In winter, ice was brought down from the mountains or frozen in shallow pools overnight. It was then piled into these subterranean chambers, insulated by thick walls and cooled by circulating air. Months later, in the middle of summer, you could walk in, chip off a chunk of ice, and plop it into your drink. Yes, while Europeans were still sweating through summers with nothing but fans and complaints, Persian nobles were sipping chilled drinks under the desert sun. Because of course they were. And to be fair, even ordinary townspeople benefited. Ice was stored in bulk for markets and festivals, not just royal feasts. Still, you can bet the wealthy made a point of showing off how much ice they could serve in July. Because what's the point of innovation if you can't brag about it? The design of these ice houses, called yakchuls, was genius. Thick mud brick walls, sometimes more than 2 meters thick, kept heat out. The domed roof vented hot air, and when paired with a wind tower, cool drafts circulated constantly, preserving the ice inside. Some even had underground channels connecting directly to Qanats, adding extra cooling. Basically, these were the world's first industrial freezers, except they were powered by nothing but wind and water. Now, pause for a moment and imagine daily life around this. A merchant in Yazd hauls goods across a blazing bazaar. Sweat clings to his tunic, dust stings his throat. He ducks into a shop where the sardab is cool, a breeze filtering down. The shopkeeper offers him a drink of sharbat, water sweetened with fruit syrup, chilled with a sliver of stored ice. He sips, sighs, and for a moment forgets the desert outside. That's not just comfort. That's survival dressed up as hospitality. The connection between architecture and community here was profound. Qanats were maintained by families, passed down as inheritances. Ice houses were public utilities as much as private luxuries. Wind towers crowned homes, mosques, and markets alike. Cooling wasn't a personal gadget hidden in a wall, it was a shared system, woven into the very bones of the city. You lived with it. You relied on it. And you respected the people who maintained it. Of course, nothing was perfect. Qanats needed constant cleaning, or they clogged. Ice houses sometimes failed if walls cracked or if summer storms damaged ventilation. And if the wind wasn't blowing, the tower just sat there looking fancy and useless. But overall, the system worked astonishingly well. So well that some wind towers are still standing today, and a few yakchuls still hold ice every summer, more than 1,000 years after they were built. Think about that the next time your air conditioner breaks after 5 years and a warranty that mysteriously expired last month. The Persians would probably shake their heads, sip their iced sherbet, and mutter, "Amateurs." So tonight, as you drift, Imagine walking into one of those ancient domes. The walls thick, cool to the touch. The air dry and crisp. Beneath you, blocks of ice stacked in the shadows, glistening faintly in torchlight. Outside, the desert blazes. Inside, time feels frozen. That's the quiet miracle of Persian ingenuity, wind, water, and patience, turning a hostile desert into a place where you could relax, refresh, and even chill. So far, we've been lounging in courtyards, hiding in underground sardabs, and sneaking into ice houses for a chilled drink. But wind towers weren't just for private homes or wealthy estates. They were everywhere. Mosques, markets, inns along the trade routes, all of them breathed with the same desert rhythm. If the courtyard was the heart of the Persian home, the wind tower was the lungs of the Persian city. Let's start with mosques. Picture a vast prayer hall, sunlight spilling through latticed windows, the murmur of voices rising in unison. The air is heavy, thick with incense and bodies. Without ventilation, it would be unbearable. But above, the wind towers rise like watchful eyes, scooping breezes and funneling them down into the hall. The result? Air circulation that kept the faithful from fainting in the middle of sermons. Practical, yes, but also symbolic. The wind, invisible and constant, became a reminder of divine presence. Spiritual and literal breath, moving together. Then there were the bazaars. Oh, the bazaars. Imagine narrow covered alleys lined with stalls. Carpets, spices, copper pots, bolts of silk. The air should have been suffocating, hundreds of bodies pressed close, heat radiating off walls baked all day by the sun. But here, too, wind towers came to the rescue. Towers built into the bazaar roofs pulled air through the long corridors. Shoppers drifted through in relative comfort, their purses a little lighter by the time they left. And yes, sellers probably bragged about their stall being the coolest corner of the market, because marketing hasn't changed much in 1,000 years. Caravanserais, the great roadside inns of the Silk Road, also relied on wind towers. Traders came from China, India, Arabia, hauling goods across deserts. They needed food, water, and rest. A caravanserai without a breeze was a nightmare. One with wind towers was an oasis. Picture dusty merchants unloading camels, then stepping into a shaded courtyard where the air, while not exactly crisp, was at least moving. Rooms lined the edges, towers above funneled drafts, and for a night, weary travelers could breathe easier. Honestly, these places were as important for commerce as the roads themselves. Without them, the Silk Road might have been more of a silk crawl. Whole cityscapes were shaped by the towers. Walk into Yazd, one of the best preserved desert cities in Persia, and you see a skyline of domes, minarets, and wind towers rising like elegant chimneys. Some were slender and square, others octagonal, some clustered together like organ pipes. Each one angled to catch the prevailing winds, each one part of the city's great, invisible cooling system. It gave Yazd its nickname, the City of Windcatchers. And even today, you can stand there, look up at the towers swaying slightly in the heat shimmer, and know you're seeing the same sight someone saw 500 years ago. And of course, architecture shaped social rhythm. Market days were survivable because of the breeze. Friday prayers were endurable because the air moved. Travelers could keep going because their caravanserai gave them a break from the suffocating sun. Even courts and palaces relied on wind towers to keep their endless councils from dissolving into sweaty bickering. Which, honestly, may have saved a few wars. Nothing like a cool draft to keep tempers in check. It's tempting to call these towers just ventilation, but they were more than that. They were civic infrastructure. Public health before the phrase existed. Urban planning disguised as decoration. Every tower meant fewer fainting bodies in a mosque, fewer heat strokes in a bazaar, fewer grumbling soldiers in a garrison. They were quiet guardians of the city, working constantly, invisibly, without complaint. Which, come to think of it, is more than can be said for most officials of the time. And the aesthetics mattered too. Wind towers weren't slapped together like utility poles. They were designed, carved, decorated with arches and tile. A tower could be both functional and beautiful, catching the eye while catching the breeze. For Persians, the two went hand in hand. Comfort and elegance weren't enemies, they were partners. Which is why you can still stand in front of a badger today and think, yes, that's lovely, while also sighing in relief when a draft brushes your face. So, when you think of ancient Persian cities, don't imagine barren stone streets or endless sand. Imagine shaded courtyards, covered markets, travelers resting in breezy inns, children splashing in courtyard pools while a tower hums softly above. A city not fighting against the desert, but breathing with it. Let's pause there. Picture yourself strolling through a bazaar. The smell of spices thick in the air, copper pans clattering, merchants calling out. The heat presses in, but then, a breeze slides through, lifting the edge of your sleeve, carrying a hint of coolness. For a moment, the whole place feels alive, vibrant, almost gentle. That's the quiet miracle of the wind tower, not in a single home, but in the life of a city. By now, you can probably tell that wind towers weren't just bricks and vents. They were more than cooling systems. They were part of how Persians thought about themselves, their place in the desert, and even their souls. Because in Persia, architecture was never just practical, it was poetry in clay and stone. Persian poets loved metaphors. A rose wasn't just a flower, it was beauty and fragility. A nightingale wasn't just a bird, it was longing and loss. And a wind tower, that became a symbol too. Towers breathed for the house, just as the soul breathed for the body. The cool breeze represented divine mercy, unseen but always present. A home without a tower felt lifeless, just as a body without spirit was nothing but clay. In verses and songs, wind became breath, breath became life, and the tower was the vessel that caught it. You'd also find wind towers in stories of hospitality. To welcome a guest wasn't only to offer bread and tea. It was to offer coolness, a seat in the shaded courtyard where the breeze moved gently. The tower became a silent host, extending kindness without words. In Persian culture, where hospitality was almost sacred, this mattered. A host's reputation wasn't just about food or wealth, it was about how comfortable you made your guest. And nothing said comfort like walking into a house cooled by the desert's own breath. Even religion wove itself into the towers. In Islamic architecture, air and water often symbolized purity. A mosque with a pool and a wind tower wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Worshippers prayed in flowing air, reminding them of God's invisible presence, sustaining and unseen. To pray in a stagnant hall would have felt wrong. To pray in a breezy one was a reminder of divine grace. And of course, the towers became status symbols. A taller, more ornate tower signaled wealth and refinement. Families boasted about how well their towers worked, how sweetly the air flowed through their sardabs. Just as some modern people brag about their central air or their energy-efficient system, Persians showed off their wind towers. The irony, of course, is that while our modern systems choke on bills and repairs, theirs just kept working, century after century, with nothing more than wind and maintenance. Travelers, too, wrote about them in ways that went beyond utility. Some called them traps for the sky. Others described them as silent guardians. There was something uncanny about a structure that worked invisibly, catching something you couldn't see and turning it into comfort. No gears, no wheels, no fire, just air. For people used to smoke-belching chimneys or noisy mills, the quiet elegance of a wind tower seemed almost supernatural. And then there's identity. In cities like Yazd, the skyline of wind towers became as recognizable as domes and minarets. They were markers of place. To look up and see dozens of towers was to know you were home. To outsiders, they became the symbol of Persian desert cities. Tall, slender, strange to foreign eyes, but utterly practical once explained. For locals, they were simply part of the landscape, but also a source of pride. It's funny how architecture can shape self-image like that. Paris has its Eiffel Tower, Rome its Colosseum, New York its skyline of steel. Yazd had wind towers, less flashy, maybe, but just as defining. And perhaps more intimate. Because while grand monuments impress from a distance, a wind tower is something you feel. The coolness on your skin, the breath of relief as you step inside. A personal monument, built into daily life. So, wind towers were more than survival. They were metaphors of breath, markers of hospitality, symbols of status, and emblems of identity. They were poetry you could walk under, inhale, and live with. Let's pause on that image. A poet sitting in a sardab, writing by lamplight, the air moving gently from a tower above. Outside, the desert roars with heat and silence. Inside, words flow as smoothly as the breeze. The tower catches the wind. The poet catches the thought. And both will outlast the moment. Time is not always kind to architecture. For centuries, the wind towers stood tall, breathing life into cities. But then came the 20th century, with electricity, oil, and that marvel/menace we call air conditioning. And slowly, the towers fell silent. At first, it was subtle. Cities grew larger. Cars and buses replaced camels in the streets. New buildings went up, made of concrete and steel instead of clay and brick. Towers were expensive to maintain. Clay needed replastering, ropes and shutters needed replacing. Why bother climbing up to patch a badger when you could just stick a boxy AC unit in the wall? Progress, they said. Convenience, they said. And so, many wind towers were abandoned. Some were torn down completely, demolished to make way for new apartments or offices. Others were left standing, but useless, their vents bricked up, their channels clogged with dust. They became strange relics of a world that no longer needed them. Imagine living in a Yazd home in 1970, ignoring the tower above while fiddling with a humming fan, the irony whistling louder than the absent wind. Of course, modern technology came with its own price. Air conditioning devoured electricity. Cities that once lived in harmony with the desert suddenly found themselves struggling with heat islands and rising bills. But by then, the damage was done. Many wind towers had already crumbled, their graceful arches fading into rubble. Still, not all of them vanished. Some communities, stubborn or practical, kept theirs alive. Remote towns where electricity was unreliable still relied on the old system. Families passed down the knowledge of repair, climbing the towers just as their ancestors had, patching plaster, adjusting vents. For them, the wind tower wasn't nostalgia. It was still necessity. And then came the tourists. By the late 20th century, travelers wandering through Yazd or Kashan looked up, saw the towers, and said, "Wait, what is that?" Guidebooks began to mention them. Scholars dusted off old manuscripts describing their function. Suddenly, the very thing locals had abandoned as outdated became valuable again, not just as utility, but as heritage. Preservation projects followed. Towers were repaired, museums opened, tours organized. UNESCO and other organizations declared Yazd's skyline of windcatchers a World Heritage Treasure. And so the towers found a second life, not as the beating lungs of a city, but as symbols of history. They became postcards, cultural emblems, the proud backdrop of wedding photos. Their practical function faded, but their meaning deepened. Of course, irony lingers. Walk through Yazd today, and you'll see gleaming AC units humming on the sides of homes, and above them, the graceful silhouette of a wind tower that once did the same job for free. Technology may have replaced them, but in a strange twist, the towers still outlast the machines in elegance. Your AC unit will be landfill in a decade. The badger has been standing for centuries, catching wind long after its owners stopped noticing. And in recent years, something curious has happened. Architects around the world, looking for eco-friendly design, have started paying attention again. Passive cooling, they call it now, as if Persians hadn't been doing it for 1,000 years already. New buildings in Dubai, Singapore, and even Europe experiment with modern wind towers. Which is, essentially, reinventing the wheel, or in this case, reinventing the breeze. So, decline is only half the story. Yes, many towers fell silent, but a few survived, cherished for their beauty and history. And now, in a warming world that desperately needs sustainable ideas, their wisdom whispers again. Picture it, a narrow Yazd alley at dusk. The sky glowing orange, shadows long. Above, towers stand, some broken, some whole, their openings dark. A few still breathe, a faint sigh of air slipping into the homes below. They've outlasted empires, wars, and modern fads. They've waited in silence while humans forgot them. And now, perhaps, we're beginning to remember. So here we are, at the quiet end of our story. We've climbed the towers, sat in shaded courtyards, wandered through bazaars, and watched whole cities breathe with the desert wind. And now, we stand with them in the present. Tall, silent, some crumbling, some restored, all of them reminders of what it means to live with the land instead of against it. Today, wind towers are less about survival and more about memory. They've become icons of Persian heritage, photographs on postcards, backdrops for travelers' selfies. But if you stand beneath one on a still evening, you can still feel it, the faint sigh of air moving down through brick and clay. Not as strong as it once was, maybe, but still there. A living echo of centuries. Meanwhile, in another corner of history, we're not storming palaces or sipping sherbet in a Persian courtyard. Instead, we're standing in a damp British field, staring at some really big rocks. And not just any rocks, stones carefully arranged in circles by people who lived 5,000 years ago, for reasons that remain, let's call it politely mysterious. So dim the lights, breathe out slowly, and imagine the sound of rain on grass, because this story is going to be as slow and steady as the stones themselves. Stone circles are one of those things that Britain does better than anyone else. There are hundreds of them scattered across the landscape, from the famous Stonehenge, with its Instagram-ready arches, to the lesser-known rings tucked away in sheep pastures where no tourist bus ever dares to stop. They are old. They are heavy. They are a logistical nightmare. And yet, people in the Neolithic and Bronze Age thought, yes, what we really need is to drag a bunch of multi-ton stones from miles away and line them up in a nice circle. No one knows exactly why, which is part of the charm. Let's start with Stonehenge, because honestly, you can't not. Built in stages over centuries, it's the Beyoncé of stone circles, the one everyone recognizes, the one on all the postcards. Massive sarsen stones, hauled from about 20 miles away, form the outer circle. Inside are the smaller bluestones, which archaeologists think came from Wales. Yes, Wales. As in, 150 miles away. Imagine the brainstorming session. Hey, we need smaller stones for the inside. Sure, where from? Oh, just the other side of the country. Perfect. Let's walk them here. It's either madness or dedication, or both. But Stonehenge is just one example. Across Britain, there are quieter circles. Avebury, larger in scale but less tidy. Castlerig, sitting dramatically among the fells of Cumbria. The Ring of Brodger in Orkney, windswept and lonely. Each one with its own arrangement of stones, its own relationship to the sun, moon, or horizon. Some small, barely a dozen stones. Others sprawling, enclosing entire villages. And always in circles. No squares. No triangles. Circles. Humans apparently decided geometry plus rocks equaled cosmic alignment. So what were they for? Theories abound. Temples? Calendars? Gathering places? Spaces for rituals involving, well, something more exciting than watching rocks sit still? Archaeologists have debated for centuries, and the answer is probably all of the above. People celebrated solstices here, tracked the movements of the sun, buried their dead, and probably argued over who had to carry which rock. The stones cast shadows, lined up with midsummer dawns and midwinter sunsets. Stand in the right place, on the right day, and the stones frame the sun perfectly. Was it astronomy, religion, or just a very elaborate excuse for a midsummer festival? No one knows, but we can imagine farmers gathering, fires burning, drums echoing across the fields, and someone saying, yes, this is definitely worth hauling that boulder 80 miles. And here's the soothing part, the stones don't explain themselves. They just stand. Silent. Patient. Sheep graze between them. Moss creeps along their bases. Tourists take photos, but the stones don't care. They've seen 5,000 winters. They'll see 5,000 more. So tonight, imagine yourself walking across damp grass at dawn. Mist clings low to the ground. In the distance, dark shapes rise, tall stones, arranged in a circle. You approach quietly, your breath visible in the cool air. The stones loom above you, rough, weathered, indifferent. You place your hand against one. It's cold, damp with dew, rough with lichen. You look through the gap, and just as the sun rises, light spills between two stones, casting a long shadow across the grass. You don't know why they built it. You don't need to. The silence is answer enough. The circle holds its secrets, and you drift with it, round, eternal, unbroken. One of the strangest comforts of stone circles is remembering that they didn't magically appear. They were built by people. Ordinary humans who got up in the morning, ate whatever passed for breakfast in 3000 BCE, probably something barley-based and disappointing, and then spent their day dragging rocks. The logistics are baffling. Some stones weighed 20, 30, even 40 tons. That's the equivalent of several elephants. And these weren't lying around conveniently in the fields where the circles stand. The famous Sarsens of Stonehenge came from Marlborough Downs, 20 miles away. The smaller bluestones were quarried in Wales, about 150 miles distant. Imagine being the poor guy on the planning committee who suggested that. Let's move these stones from Wales. Why? For the circle. All right, but you're carrying the first one. How did they do it? Archaeologists think ropes, sledges, and sheer stubbornness. Wooden rollers probably helped, at least on flat ground. Teams of people would drag a stone onto a sledge, then pull it across logs, replacing the logs in front as they rolled. Slow, exhausting, repetitive. On rougher terrain, they might have dragged the stones directly, lubricating the ground with water, clay, or animal fat. If rivers were nearby, rafts could have floated smaller stones part of the way. None of this was quick. Moving a single bluestone from Wales to Wiltshire might have taken weeks, if not months. And yet, they did it. Over and over. Hundreds of stones, moved and raised. Raising the stones was another ordeal. First, they dug pits. Deep, wide holes angled just right. Then, they hauled the stone upright, probably with ropes pulled by dozens of people, levering it up inch by inch with wooden poles. Once the base tipped into the pit, they backfilled earth and rubble, packing it tight. The stone stood, unshakable. And if they wanted a lintel, like at Stonehenge, the work doubled. Ramps of earth were built, the lintel dragged up, then settled into place on carefully shaped notches. Engineering, but without manuals or cranes. Every stage was labor. Days, weeks, years of labor. Generations even. Some circles were built in phases, with younger builders finishing projects their grandparents had started. Imagine inheriting a stone circle the way you'd inherit a family farm. Congrats, you're old enough to pull ropes now. We're still working on circle number 3. The numbers must have been staggering. Modern estimates suggest hundreds of people were needed to haul the largest stones. That means communities had to coordinate food, shelter, tools, and time off from farming. Building a circle wasn't a weekend project. It was a society-wide endeavor. Which makes you wonder, what compelled them? Why spend decades hauling rocks when you could be, I don't know, inventing better porridge? The answer is lost, but the effort itself tells us it mattered. Whatever rituals, whatever beliefs, whatever community identity was tied to those stones, it was powerful enough to move mountains. Or at least, to move 40-ton slabs of sandstone. And here's where it gets strangely soothing. The stones stand not just as monuments, but as records of persistence. Each one says, people once cared enough to do this. To drag me here, to set me upright, to watch me cast a shadow. They remind us of labor, patience, and the slow, steady work of hands over time. So tonight, picture the scene. A damp morning on the plain. Dozens of people tugging at ropes, their feet sliding in the mud. A massive stone lurches forward on wooden rollers, creaking and groaning like a stubborn beast. Children run alongside, shouting encouragement. Dogs bark. A foreman yells to keep the rhythm. Hours later, the stone is dragged into place near a pit, ropes looped over it like reins. Slowly, it tips, then rises, then settles with a deep thud into the earth. Cheers go up. Another piece of the circle stands. The day ends. People slump by fires, eating bread and stew, aching from the work. Tomorrow, they'll do it again. And again. Until the circle is complete. And 5,000 years later, you're still looking at their work. The stones don't care who hauled them, but they remember the labor in their silence. If the stones were just heavy landscaping projects, we wouldn't still be talking about them. But the truth is, the circles mattered. They weren't barns, they weren't watchtowers, they weren't defensive walls. They were built to face the sky, to catch the sun, to shape shadows. And in a world without written calendars, that mattered. Take Stonehenge, again. The alignment is famous. Stand in the right spot at midsummer dawn, and the sun rises perfectly over the heel stone, flooding the circle with light. At midwinter sunset, the sun sets between specific uprights. It's too neat to be an accident. The builders clearly cared about marking the longest and shortest days. The circle became, in a sense, a giant seasonal clock. Why? Because knowing when the seasons turned was crucial. Farmers needed to plant at the right time, harvest before the cold, prepare for the lean months. The stones gave a cosmic schedule, one written not on paper but in shadow and light. But it wasn't just agriculture. The solstices were spiritual too. Imagine hundreds of people gathering at dawn, fires burning, drums echoing. The sun peaks above the horizon, framed by stone, and the crowd gasps. Priests chant, offerings are made, maybe beer is passed around. It's part festival, part worship, part reassurance that the world is still in order. The sun still rises, the seasons still turn, the circle still holds. Burials add another layer. Around many stone circles, archaeologists have found barrows, cremation pits, and burial mounds. Some circles, like Stonehenge in its earliest phase, were surrounded by cremated remains. This suggests the circles were also places of the dead. Maybe they marked a boundary between worlds, stones as eternal guardians watching over human bones. The living gathered here, the dead rested here, the sun rose and set here. All of time in one circle. And of course, burials mean stories. People may have remembered ancestors at these sites, telling tales of who was buried, who built which stone. Circles became memory palaces, anchoring community identity in rock and shadow. Then there were festivals. Circles could hold hundreds of people, perfect for gatherings. Food, feasting, music. Archaeological digs at nearby sites have found animal bones, pottery shards, drinking vessels. People didn't just worship. They partied. Imagine fires blazing, people roasting meat, laughter and chatter filling the night while stones loomed silently in the background. The stones probably didn't mind. And here's the strange, soothing thought. The exact rituals are lost. We'll never know the chants, the dances, the prayers. We can only guess. But the stones don't need explanations. Their silence is part of the ritual now. They remind us that people once cared deeply enough to align their world with the sky, to build places where life and death, sun and shadow, feast and mourning all met. So tonight, picture midsummer at a circle like Castlerig in Cumbria. The fells rise around you, mist drifting low. A crowd gathers in the ring, faces turned east. The horizon glows. A chant begins, low and rhythmic. Then, as the first ray of sunlight spills over the stones, the crowd erupts in cheer. Someone blows a horn. Children dance. Fires are lit. The stones, indifferent, simply cast long shadows on the damp grass. Hours later, the festival begins, roasting meat, shared cups, laughter. The sun arcs overhead. By evening, some stagger home, others collapse on the grass. The stones remain, silent witnesses to human joy and exhaustion. And long after the people leave, the stones stay, catching moonlight now, waiting for the next gathering. The thing about stone circles is that they make us imagine mystery. Rites, shadows, gods. But the people who built them? They also had to eat, sleep, and argue about whose turn it was to feed the pigs. Life around the circles was not just cosmic, it was domestic. Villages sprung up near many circles. Excavations around Stonehenge uncovered what archaeologists call Durrington Walls, a massive settlement nearby, where builders and festival-goers lived. Think wooden huts, packed earth floors, smoke curling from hearths. Families crammed into single-room houses, sleeping on straw mats, eating from clay bowls. No plumbing, no privacy, just a smoky, noisy hub of Neolithic life. And the smell? Let's be honest, probably not great. Fires indoors meant constant smoke. Livestock were close at hand: pigs, cattle, sheep. People and animals lived close, and winter meant mud everywhere. Glamorous? It was not. Food tells us a lot. Bones from Durrington walls suggest feasting was common. Pigs roasted whole, cattle bones split for marrow. Some animals were brought from far away, suggesting families traveled with their livestock to join in festivals. Imagine the sound: herds driven across Britain to supply one enormous barbecue under the watch of the stones. Everyday meals were simpler: barley porridge, flatbreads baked on stones, maybe some berries or nuts. Ale was likely, thin, sour, barely alcoholic, but safer than untreated water. Children grew up gnawing on bread crusts, watching their parents haul stones by day and drink warm barley brew by night. Clothing was practical: wool tunics, leather shoes, cloaks fastened with simple pins. Nothing fancy, though we can guess some dyed fabrics or decorated beads showed up at festivals. Jewelry was made from bone, stone, or carved amber. And yes, some people wore feathers in their hair, because even Neolithic fashion had its trends. Community life revolved around work. Building and maintaining circles wasn't a side hobby. It was a communal task. Everyone had a role: quarrying, hauling, cooking, weaving ropes, tending fires, carving wooden rollers. Children fetched water. Elders told stories to keep spirits up. The act of building may have been as important as the finished monument. Hauling stones became a ritual of belonging, proof that you were part of the community. Archaeology even hints at seasonal rhythms. People didn't live at Stonehenge year-round. They gathered in winter and summer, tied to solstices, then dispersed to smaller farms. This makes sense. The circles weren't towns, they were gathering points. For a few weeks, life swelled: music, feasting, ceremonies. Then, silence. The stones stood empty, the wind whistling through, waiting for the next season. Health was tough. Skeletons show worn teeth, arthritis from hard labor, and injuries from hauling. People didn't live long by modern standards, maybe 30 or 40 years. Children often didn't survive infancy. And yet, there's evidence of care. Bones show healed fractures, meaning people looked after each other. Families mattered. Communities supported their injured. Even in harsh conditions, tenderness survived. And then there's the storytelling. We don't know the words, but we can imagine nights around the fire, children wide-eyed as elders spun tales of why the stones mattered, how ancestors watched from the shadows, how the sun and moon wove meaning into the circle. The stones weren't just monuments, they were backdrops for myth, stage sets for memory. So tonight, picture one of those winter gatherings. The circle looms on the horizon, but in the valley nearby, huts glow with firelight. Smoke drifts upward, mingling with the stars. Families sit around hearths, bowls of porridge steaming, children dozing under cloaks. Outside, pigs squeal, dogs bark, and somewhere, a drunk uncle sings off-key. Tomorrow, work continues: hauling stones, cutting timber, digging pits. But for now, the village rests, warm against the cold, stories echoing in the dark. The stones wait above, silent, while life stirs below, ordinary, messy, human. By the time the Romans arrived in Britain, the stone circles were already ancient. The builders were long gone, their reasons forgotten, their communities dissolved into mist. Which meant one thing: the field was wide open for stories. And if there's one thing humans do well, it's inventing explanations for things we don't understand. Giants were a popular theory. Medieval chroniclers loved to explain big rocks by blaming big people. After all, who else could possibly move a 40-ton stone? One story claimed that Stonehenge was originally built in Ireland by a race of giants, who later carried it to Salisbury Plain. Which raises the question: if you're a giant, why are you building circles instead of, say, houses that actually fit you? But logic was not the strong suit here. Giants made for good storytelling, and that was enough. Then came the Druids. By the 17th and 18th centuries, antiquarians, the pre-archaeologists, with more imagination than evidence, decided that stone circles must have been Druidic temples. Druids were the intellectual elite of Celtic society, described by Roman writers as philosophers, priests, and occasional sacrifices of unfortunate people. Later writers stretched that into a full-blown image of druids in white robes, chanting at dawn as the sun rose between stones. Romantic, atmospheric, and almost certainly wrong, since the circles predated the druids by more than 1,000 years. But once the image took hold, it stuck. Even today, you'll find modern druids gathering at Stonehenge during solstices, dressed in flowing robes, chanting prayers. The irony is, they're performing ceremonies that have more to do with Victorian imagination than with the original Neolithic builders. But the stones don't mind. They've hosted stranger things. Folklore also gave us petrified dancers. Some circles were said to be groups of people turned to stone for dancing on the Sabbath. Others were armies frozen in place by magic. A circle in Cornwall is still called the Merry Maidens, supposedly a group of girls punished for dancing on Sunday. The nearby stones are the pipers, the musicians who played for them. If nothing else, these stories tell us one thing: humans have always loved a good morality tale about why you should behave, or risk being turned into a geological feature. Fairies and spirits got involved too. Stones were said to move at night, to walk to nearby rivers for a drink, to spin around when church bells rang. Farmers swore that if you counted the stones by day, you'd get one number, but if you counted them at night, you'd get another. Mischievous spirits, always fiddling with arithmetic. And of course, people thought circles had healing powers. Cows driven through gaps between stones were cured of illness. Sick children passed around a circle might be healed. Lovers carved their initials into the rocks, hoping for eternal fidelity. The stones became less like monuments and more like magical neighbors, consulted for problems ranging from colds to romance. By the 19th century, the circles had shifted again in meaning. Romantics and poets saw them as picturesque ruins of a mystical past. Artists painted misty scenes of lone wanderers standing before ancient stones, communing with eternity. Tourists tramped across fields to sketch them. Stonehenge, once a lonely ruin, became a national icon, though locals grumbled about people stealing bits of stone as souvenirs. And the stones just kept standing, indifferent to all the theories. Giants, druids, maidens, spirits, all stories layered onto the same silent rocks. The real builders remained faceless, while later generations filled the void with whatever stories they needed. Which is, in its own way, a kind of ritual. Each era reimagined the circles to fit itself, wrapping new meaning around old stone. So tonight, picture a medieval farmer leading his cows past a circle at dusk. He glances nervously at the stones, mutters a quick prayer, and urges the animals along. Somewhere nearby, a child whispers the tale of dancers turned to rock. Centuries later, a Victorian poet stands in the same field, notebook in hand, scribbling lines about ancient druids. And today, a tourist with a phone takes a picture, hashtags it #mystical. The stones don't care. They keep their secrets, letting each generation tell its own story. Archaeology has done its best to chip away at the silence of the stones. Excavations, carbon dating, geophysical surveys, all of it has given us glimpses. We know the builders farmed barley, herded cattle, roasted pigs. We know the stones line up with solstices, that burials clustered nearby, that feasts left behind broken pots and split bones. We can reconstruct ropes and sledges, model how long it would take to drag a bluestone from Wales. And yet, after all the science, the core question still hangs in the air. Why? Why did they choose circles? Why did they devote centuries of labor to shaping landscapes with stone? Why did they return, generation after generation, to add, rebuild, and realign? The stones don't answer. That's the strange gift of them. They resist closure. Unlike a ruined palace or a broken tablet, there's no text, no inscription, no carved relief to explain. Just silence. Which means every visitor has to meet them halfway. Archaeologists bring theories. Folklore brings giants and druids. Tourists bring cameras. You and I bring curiosity. The stones stand, patient, letting each new layer of meaning wash over them. Rediscovery was almost accidental. For centuries, the circles sat quietly in fields, used as landmarks for sheep or as quarries for building stone. Farmers ploughed around them. Villagers told stories about them but didn't think much beyond that. It wasn't until the Enlightenment and the rise of antiquarian interest that scholars started cataloguing them, sketching them, arguing about their origins. By then, they were already thousands of years old. Even now, many are little visited. Beyond Stonehenge and Avebury, countless smaller circles stand in lonely fields, half-tumbled, mossy, wind-whipped. No ticket booths, no guides, just stones, and silence, and perhaps a sheep or two watching you with bored eyes. And perhaps that's the most comforting thing. These weren't monuments built to dominate. They weren't fortresses or palaces screaming authority. They were gatherings of stone, meant for gathering people. They endure not because they were defended, but because they were simply too heavy to move. Their survival feels almost accidental, yet strangely deliberate, as if endurance was the point all along. So tonight, imagine standing at one in the fading light. The sky bruises purple, the air smells of damp earth. The stones rise around you, weathered, scarred, flecked with lichen. No crowds, no guides, no ropes. Just you and them. You run a hand across one, rough, cool, ancient. Above, the first stars prick through the clouds. The same stars the builders saw, the same stars the feasting villagers watched, the same stars medieval farmers prayed under. The stones don't move. They don't speak. But they remind you, quietly, that people were here before, that people will be here after. That time is less a line than a circle. In the end, that may be their message. Not answers, but endurance. Rituals fade, stories shift, civilizations fall. But the stones remain. Silent, patient, eternal. And in their silence, they let us rest too.